Good morning. Welcome to Newfoundland and Labrador Public Libraries. I'm Tracy Vaughan Evans from the Carbonear Public Library. Today in the library we have author Philip Earle here to discuss his new book, I'll Go the Length of Meself. This is the story of Newfoundland's most daring rascal, Captain Guy Earle, who is North America's youngest master mariner. Welcome, Phil.
Well, thank you. It was nice to be here, and thanks for the opportunity.
You're welcome.
To inform your library customers about this book.
I think it's going to be well received. There's a lot of interest in it already, Phil.
Well, thank you.
I wanted to start by reading some of your words in your introduction, because I think it sets the tone. And I'd also like to read from Reverend Dr. Wayne Cole, because that really takes me into my first question on the book. In the intro, Captain Guy was a boy at the start of the Roaring Twenties, when the spirit of the venture and personal challenge was the rage. If anyone was a product of the Newfoundland schooner background and the excitement of the 20s, it was Captain Guy. He took to the times like a fish to water. This book is a testament to his remarkable character and the accomplishments of his lifetime as a mariner and a prominent fish merchant. That's your words, Phil, on your father. And Dr. Reverend Wayne Cole. Reading this book, some will be intrigued with the man's ability as a master mariner, others entertained by his daring exploits, and others moved by the humanitarianism, and others by his quick actions and without thought of his own safety, jumped into a crisis situation to help others. I would implore all to avail of this book and see the big picture and experience the totality of this great man who would go the length of himself to accomplish his every desire. I think what Wayne wrote is really the cusp of everything that's in the book. And it leads me to my first question, which is about the title of the book, I'll Go the Length of Meself, and how it relates to the artwork that was done by Sid Butt in the book. And it's at the top of each chapter. It's a coil of fishing rope. And I know there's something to it. So could you please explain that to me?
Well, first of all, it's really quite wonderful for Dr. Reverend Wayne Cole to make those kind words about Skipper Guy, and for someone else of his stature to recognize the qualities and the character of Captain Guy. It's really, really rewarding for me. Now, the title of the book, I'll Go the Length of Meself, first of all, was something I heard my father say one time when I was a young man. It was a situation amongst men, and apparently it's an expression that was used by the seamen back in the day. Now, you have to go back a generation ago, even 100 years ago. This was the language of seamen, sailors. And I'll go the length of myself usually meant, well, the ship will go the length of herself, which meant the length of the chain or the cable or the rope that was on the anchor. And when all the rope was out, that was the length of herself. That's as far as she could go. And that expression came from, in England, when they made coils of rope in that day, the rope was stretched out in a continuous straight line of 600 feet. There was building 600 feet long, and the fibers were stretched out and they were twisted. And as the inspectors would walk up and down, seeing the process, they had to walk the 600 feet, which is 100 fathom. That was a coil of rope. That was the length of the coil of rope. It was the rope walk length. That's what they called. And that phrase, when the coil of rope went aboard for an anchor on the ships, it was the length of the coil of rope. It was the length of herself. And seamen picked up on that phrase. Eventually that rope became a cable and then became chains, but they were still roughly the same length. But the seamen used to use the phrase, when they gave it their all, when they worked the hardest, if they were in a scuffle, they gave it their best. It was called, I went the length of myself. And I heard my father say that one time. I was about 16 or 17, and it just stuck in my mind that everything I had seen him do since I was a little boy was him. He went the length of himself, and it was a beautiful title for the book, and everything he did in his life, whether it was a game of checkers, or driving the car, or sailing the boat when he was in his prime, or running a business, he went the length of himself.
That's beautiful.
And the second part of your question, which is there's 12 chapters, and it just hit me one day that in chapter 1, the coil of rope, which was still wound up, I took a little bit of the rope off to bring underneath the title of chapter 1. And chapter 2, there was another coil turn taken off the coil that started to wind up on the left-hand side.
I noticed there was a difference.
Yeah, and as you go each chapter, the coil on the right, which is not used yet, is unwound or uncoiled to go up on the other side used. And in chapter 12, the end of the book, the coil had been used from the right, gone over to the left. That was the length of itself, the length of the coil of rope, and that was the length of my father's life. Chapter 12 was the end of his life. He died early age, really 50 in his sleep, but that's what that meant.
That's beautiful, Phil, and it makes great sense to me now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, it fit his life, yeah.
And with that, it takes us to chapter 8, and your first reading. The chapter is on page 121. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. And this really hit me. The Danish philosopher Kierkegaard. To dare is to briefly lose your confidence. Not to dare is to lose yourself. When I read that, Phil, at this particular point in the book, it really hit me that was so much your father.
Well, thank you again, and you're right. At least that's the way I saw it. It's so true that without, to dare is to briefly use your confidence. Like if you were walking on a high wire, or if you're doing something dangerous, but if you don't dare, you lose yourself. If you're afraid of dying, if you're afraid of failure, you can't venture to be successful. And this fit my father because he was always daring. For momentarily, he would lose his confidence, but it made him have a great life. The person who dares and ventures, the rewards are tremendous.
They're living.
And my father, he lived for the day, for the moment, fully, and this applies to him. And let me just, a little brief introduction to it. It was in Baie des Verdes in the mid-1950s, when the Lila Bootler, the schooner, came into harbor at night with goods for the town, but the harbor was full of slab ice and she couldn't get into the wharf. So I pick up the story from there. The Lila Bootler came into the harbor of Baie des Verdes. She couldn't get to the wharf because she was too far out to reach with a heaving line because slab ice. The skipper arrived in his car and sized up the situation. He asked anyone if they knew for any snowshoes, and a man from the community said there was a pair in Moore's store next to the wharf. It was 10 p.m., and of course the store was closed. But that didn't deter Guy. He went straight to the shop, broke the lock, went into the building, found a pair of shoes, and took them down to the beach. He put them on, tied a rope around his waist, and gave the other end to the men on the beach. It was dark and snowing, and the schooner was now barely visible. He told the men, "I'm going to run out to her over the ice. If you lose the sight of me, pull me back." Mm-hmm. With that, he took off running from the beach toward the boat. And when he was almost to the side of the ship, the men lost sight of him. They thought he might be in trouble, so they pulled on the rope to get him back. Well, Guy lost his forward momentum and balance and started to sink. He managed to turn around and get himself back to the beach, cold and wet. He didn't get to the boat that night, and some of the men admired his daring. while others smirked at his failure. His answer to them was simple: nothing ventured, nothing gained. What the skipper did that night was not just about the success or failure of what he attempted. It represented something bigger about him that he had all his life: his desire to reach beyond his limit. Regardless of the outcome, if something was possible and needed to be done, he had to try to do it. That was the essence of Captain Guy. Guy dared to try and do what others knew was not possible.
And that takes us to this story. I can't even imagine being in wartime, but being a young man and a young master mariner, and it was their trip to Portugal.
Yeah.
So it's in the chapter Guy's first schooner and first trip to Portugal.
Yes. Okay. Well,
if you could set that up.
Sure. I'll give you a little brief, the listener, a little brief interview on this. First of all, his father took Guy to sea with him on the schooner when he was 8 years old, to Labrador and around the coast with salt fish, etc. And Guy took to the sea, took to the schooner, he loved it. And when he was 16, he became captain. He became coastal captain, which meant you could take the schooner, the Maritimes around the coast. And at 16, he had a coastal captain's ticket. And 2 years later, at 18, he wrote his Master Mariner's test, which mean you can travel any ocean in the world, not just coastal. It's a much bigger thing. It's the entire planet. And you had to be 21 to write your ticket, but he forged his age 3 years. And Captain John Whalen, who gave him the test, who was a Master Mariner himself, said that Guy Earle was the youngest, the smartest that ever took the test. Now, I'll pick up the story from there on his first trip to Portugal, and I'll show you that on the cover is a picture of Captain Guy on that trip at 19 years old with a sextant, taking the sighting, crossing to go to Portugal. And on that trip, he set the record that had been there for over 100 years of sailing boats, a very prideful thing in Newfoundland. They all pride themselves on who had the record to cross the Atlantic. Well, Skipper Guy at 19, a Master Mariner, broke the record in 10 days. And I'll pick up the story as to when the ship got off the coast of Portugal. It's a fascinating story, and it shows a lot about his character when he was in his prime. When they arrived off the coast of Portugal, a storm came up with gale winds on the land. A serious situation on that coast for a sailing ship. Luckily, the ship had a small 35 horsepower auxiliary diesel engine, which would occasionally be used if becalmed or if they had to get clear of the land. The gale was still on 2 days later, with conditions getting worse. As she went up and down the coast, with big seas making it impossible to enter any harbor, sometimes the engine would be used to keep her to sea away from the cliffs. There was a real possibility she would be blown down the coast and make it difficult for her to get back to port. By this time, nerves were on end, and the decision was made between mate Fred Rossiter and the skipper that they would go into Oporto, despite the danger of wrecking on the harbor's sandbar. The mate reminded the skipper also that the port was closed because of the war, and no ships allowed to enter. The mate said, "What in the world are we going to do?" The skipper came up with the idea in the moment to drain the engine's fuel tank. If asked why they entered the port, it would be because they were out of engine fuel and in danger of being driven ashore in a storm. When the oil was pumped from the tank into an oil drum, they headed for the mouth of Oporto Harbor. The entrance to Oporto Harbor is very dangerous, since there are some shoals and sandbars at the entrance which can cause incoming seas to rise up to tremendous heights. And in fact, in the years before, many Newfoundland ships and crews had been lost and drowned on that bar. As they got closer to Oporto Harbor, they could see large waves rising above the shoals. Nevertheless, the decision had been made. They were going in, and there was no turning back. Skipper Guy climbed upon the rigging of the cross trees of the foremast, and the mate climbed up halfway on the mizzen behind him. The plan was for the skipper to give directions for the ship to the mate below him, and in turn the mate would signal the two men lashed to the wheel on her stern. Things went fine until they were halfway through the entrance. But then, to the fright of all hands on board, a monster sea rose up behind her, towering over the ship and coming at her at a tremendous speed. It covered the deck with water when it hit, and nothing of the boat could be seen on looking down from the rigging but the tops of the two deckhouses. She was on the water, and the mate got wet 30 feet up above her deck. Skipper Guy saw his ship submerged and thought she was gone. He kicked off one of his leather boots, straps leathered up to the knees, and as it fell, hitting the mate in the head. He was getting ready to kick off the other boot so he could swim ashore, but finally, the boat started to shiver and rise as the water flowed off her deck left and right. Gradually, her rails came to the surface as water poured over her sides and she began to move into the harbor. The men on the wheel were still lashed on, totally drenched. When they got into the harbor, all hands were happy to still be alive.
Mm-hmm.
In no time, a patrol boat came alongside, and officers came aboard wanting to speak to the captain. Skipper Guy, the boy captain, was standing on deck in his ragged work clothes and answered, "I'm the captain." "No, I want to see the ship's captain," the officer replied. "That's me, sir," said the skipper. The officer clearly didn't believe such a young chick could be the captain. Finally, he said, "This is a closed port, and no ships are allowed to enter the harbor because of the war." They were taken ashore to the commandant's office. There they were led into the head office, which had cabinets around the wall and a big desk sitting in front of the window overlooking them out of the harbor. The commandant told them the port had been closed because of German submarines attacking British ships, and they would have to fine them £120. The skipper said, "That's a large fine for our small company, and it will ruin us." The commandant asked where they were from and what was their cargo. The skipper replied, "We're 10 days out from St. John's with a load of fish for Portugal." The commandant began to soften his voice and said, "How old are you?" 23, sir," was the reply. The commandant shook his head incredulously. He couldn't believe that such a young man was in charge of a small sailing ship that had crossed the U-boat-infested waters of the North Atlantic. He said, "You did an excellent job of bringing her in, like a Britisher would, like a Newfoundlander would," shot back the skipper. The commandant continued, "You're so young, I can't find it in my heart to fine you that much. I'll charge you £2. The skipper appreciated this and expressed his gratitude, then saying, "We had to come into a porter, sir. We had no other choice. We were offshore 2 days in the storm and ran out of diesel. 'Twas better for all of us to go to jail than to be drowned." "So you were out of fuel," the commandant intimated. He then told a man to go aboard the schooner and check for fuel. A short while later, the man came back and reported there was an inch of fuel left in the bottom of the tank. Then, to the surprise of the skipper and his crew, the commandant invited them all out to lunch. As they turned to leave his office, the commandant, who was humbled to have met such an incredible mariner, asked the skipper respectfully, "I was looking at you with the spyglass when you were crossing the bar, when the sea went over the ship. I saw something fall from her spar. What was it?" The skipper pointed to his bare foot and said sincerely, "I kicked off me boot overboard and was going to kick off the other one to get ready to swim ashore because I thought me ship was gone. But I didn't because she started to rise." The commandant was speechless and had never seen such a cavalier young man. And I doubt he ever met anyone again like Skipper Guy Earle. Every trip with the skipper was an experience of daring and excitement. That's what he lived for. Nothing deterred Guy Earle. And when he was young, he had plans and places to go and things to do. And he was always in a hurry to get there.
You just mesmerized me. I'm not sure if it's Guy that mesmerized me or your reading, Phil. It's unbelievable.
It's Captain Guy
But
who
at
was unbelievable.
23, he had the wits about him and enough of a lad in him to come up with that plan to get them in.
Well, you bring out a point which you're obviously very aware, but this was a trait that Guy, my father, had all his life. He had a mind of his own. He could instantly see and size up a problem, and in the same moment, he had the solution. He did this with everything in his life. It was on the spur of the moment. He saw the problem, and when he saw the problem, he had the answer, and he was already doing it. Everyone said the same thing, making the decision to drain the oil tank in case they got questioned. Well, we had to come in because there's no oil in our tank. Mm-hmm. When he got up on the spar, he went up to give directions that you could see the shoals, go port, go starboard. Well, when he was up there, she was going to sink. And he said, well, I kick off my boots. He was already getting ready to swim ashore.
He was daring.
Well, that was, yes, part of his life too, Very daring, very brave character,
And that leads right into the next chapter.
The Family of
Mariners.
Another story at sea, which
is wartime.
Wartime, and it wasn't far from Oporto. They were on their way to Cadiz, Spain, and I'll pick up a story here. On another winter crossing, a few years after the Oporto story, Skipper Guy and his crew were en route to Gibraltar in the Bretagne with a load of fish, cod, and they had the bad luck of crossing paths with a German U-boat. During the war, this was. At first, there was no sign of anything until the submarine surfaced ahead of them. With much concern, they lowered their sails as the sub drifted alongside. A young German captain in the tower asked what their cargo was, to which Skipper Guy replied, Newfoundland salt cod bound for Cadiz, Spain. He then asked for the captain, to which the skipper answered, I'm the captain. There was a silence for a few moments, and nobody knew what was going to happen. Then the U-boat captain came out on the deck and asked, Can you give us some fish? We're low on food. Yes, sir, replied the skipper. Some of the German crew got in a raft with guns on, came alongside, and fish was put aboard. They returned the fish to their boat and came back once more for a second load. There was an unnerving tension, as no one knew what their fate would be. Just before they left, one of the German crew reached into the raft and handed over a pair of long U-boat coning anti-aircraft spyglasses, a gift of appreciation to the undaunted Skipper Guy. No other words were spoken, only the wave of one mariner's hand to another, both whom who knew each man had his own duty to do during the war. The sails were raised again, and the U-boat disappeared out of sight. Perhaps it was the impression given by the young Skipper Guy that saved the Newfoundland crew that day. Or maybe it was the recognition by the German captain that a family of seamen aboard the schooner were closer to him than the family of his homeland in Germany. The universal family of those who go down to the ships and sea.
But when you're being saved through food, and there's the rule of the seas, I think even during wartime.
Well, as I said there, it's a kind of what Joseph Conrad, who was a great mariner, a great writer, he would say these kind. There's a feeling between seamen who sail the world and are in similar conditions, and once you get out there in storms and off the coast and things like this, there's something that you share, a camaraderie that only seamen have. That's deeper than your homeland. That's the meaning of that. And I think that played a big part. This captain, the German sea captains on those U-boats at the time, were the smartest people in the German Navy. They would be like astronauts today. They were brilliant, and they were young. Mm-hmm. Well, here's a young captain, 23 or 4 years old, seeing another young captain, 23 or 4 years old, a master mariner, Captain Guy, boys. And they had to have that appreciation and that respect for each other. And I think that had a lot to do with not being sunk by the submarine. Yeah.
And it takes us to the fourth reading, Phil, which is on page 196, which is about local fishermen, but it's also about that family and honor and the humanitarianism that your father showed to many people. And I think this brings us back to Newfoundland.
Sure.
And the power of friendship, kindness, and being given a leg up.
Well, that's correct, because back in that day, a generation ago, or maybe a generation is 35 years, or maybe it's 2 generations ago, it's back before 1950, that era, that pretty near all Newfoundlanders were in a similar boat, hard work, and had little, and they shared what they could with each other. And this story goes back into about 1958 in Battle Harbor on the Labrador, and fishermen on the coast, they used to come to Battle Harbor to get their winter supplies for their family, and they'd go up in the bay and stay there all winter, but they had to have flour and sugar and all this stuff. And I'll pick up the story.
Thank you.
In the fall of '58, many fishermen came to Battle Harbor to get their winter supplies at the company store. Bags of flour, sugar, boxes of tea, bologna, salt, biscuits, and this canned fruit, and this kind of enough to fill up a motorboat. Some fishermen charged these goods to the company and would pay it off with fish the following summer. Others paid it off in full, perhaps $500 or $600 at the time. Today, that'd be $4,000. That took all the money they had. One fisherman from up in St. Louis's Bay, in Mary's Harbor actually, had his boat loaded and tied up at the wharf. He went off to the office to pay his bill and then to visit some friends who lived down the harbor. He was gone a few hours, and when he came back to his boat, he was shocked to see it full of water, and his winter supply of food tipped over and was now on the bottom of the harbor, ruined. The gunwale of his boat had gotten caught in a stick on the wharf, and when the tide rode, the boat tipped and all his goods went into the harbor. The fisherman broke down and started to weep. He had lost his winter's food for his family and had no money to replace it. Just at this moment, the skipper came on the wharf and went straight to the man, asking him what was wrong. The fisherman pointed to his supplies in the bottom and said, "I've lost everything, and I'm broke, and I can't replace it." The skipper gently said, "Don't worry, me son." He took out a pencil and a piece of paper from his shirt pocket and wrote something and handed it to the fisherman and said, "Take this to Uncle Martin, the supply shed manager, and tell him to replace everything you've lost." He passed the note to the man, who said, "Skipper Guy, I can't do that. I got me money all gone." The skipper replied, "I didn't say anything about money. You go and get your plies. All I want from you is your fish next year." The skipper was busy and had to go. The fisherman didn't know what to say. He was trying to understand what had just happened. He had lost everything and then got it all back. His body had gone between 2 emotional extremes, one of shock and then of relief. He was suspended in a moment of time by a painful loss. And then, because of its recovery, because of another's kindness.
Mm-hmm. Unbelievable, Phil.
Yeah, Captain Guy was unbelievable.
Like the kindness, the humanitarianism, but also he was doing business, but the fisherman came first.
Skipper Guy did that all his life, from the time I can remember, to everybody. Every fisherman, every poor man, even people that came into our shop in Water Street, that would come in at Christmas time with nothing, that had 10 cents to buy an apple and an orange. He'd call them over. He'd give them a $100 bill. This was in the 40s and the 50s. He did it to dozens of people every Christmas Eve for 20 years. No one knew about it. He forgot about it and never spoke about it. He couldn't stand to see people poor and had nothing or were suffering. He learned it from his parents. My grandparents, their house was always open in Carbonear to people traveling through. They had a place to sleep on the day bed or the floor and a cup of tea, and then on their way for free. That was the way it used to be. That was the way all Newfoundlanders. But my father took it to the extreme. Yes.
That was his personality.
Yes.
Definitely. Now, Phil, my favorite chapter, and I know it makes me very emotional, is the birds and bake apples.
Yeah. Well, okay.
And it hit me when I read the whole book, and I've read it more than once. It hits me, and I would appreciate if you could read it.
Okay. Well, I'll just lead up to this little story here. It was in 1952, and I was a little boy, and I was on the Labrador with my father down near Black Tickle, salmon bite we had a place. But up in the bays there, in end of August, there'd be tremendous bake apples and wild birds. And I'll take up the story from there. Later in that summer of 52, after nesting time, the inlets up in the bays were full of birds and bake apples. Turs, ducks, Canadian geese, and gulls, by the thousands, and their chicks. The bake apples were so plentiful you could kneel down in a 10-foot radius and fill up a gallon can in 15 minutes. They were big, juicy, and delicious. I went up the bay birding with the skipper in an open speedboat. And the further we went, the more numerous became the birds, with their tiny broods swimming behind them in every direction. The skipper shot 6 or 7 males. He then decided to go ashore and creep through the grass over the hill to the next inlet. I crept through the bushes behind him until we got to the edge of the water. It was flat, calm, and smooth as a mirror. After a minute, a mother eider duck swam into view with 6 little baby chicks in a row behind her. We were 10 feet away from her, and she was oblivious to us. It was a beautiful thing to see, there in the silence of the wilderness, with the perfect colored feathers of the mother and innocent chicks chirping behind her as they swam in a line, making a wake on the water behind them. A scene played out in the Labrador while for millenniums. The skipper had the shotgun pointed right at her, with his finger on the trigger, waiting. 2 seconds, then 3, then 5. I whispered, "She got babies with her." They swam past us, away, but he never shot her. He had a heart, just like me. He too felt a truth, that all living innocent creatures have the beauty of life and the right to live it. We knew this was a part of Mother Nature's world that belonged to Mama Bird and her little family, but not to us. I was 7, he was 35. But at that moment, we were the same. We had the same love in our hearts. The skipper never spoke. He didn't have to speak to me, but from that moment until the day he died, I had a bond of care with him and the same need for truth. It was one of the most beautiful moments I've ever had. For days afterwards, I felt like I was the keeper and owner of the world. I was the protector of the wilderness and all the mother birds and their tiny broods. Sharing this moment with my father and the wild mother duck with her brood was a magnificent experience. It was even more so because it occurred in an enchanted place in the 1950s. At the time, this bay in Labrador had tens of thousands of nesting birds and their chicks, and when they flew south in the fall, the sky became black as they closed out the sun. Hundreds of thousands flew together in flocks over the headlands, stretching as far as the eye could see up into the bay. And it went on all day. An amazing sight to behold. I was lucky to share a few moments of my life on this grand tapestry of nature.
That was beautiful, Phil. And I know that was a very emotional piece for you to read. So I thank you. But I thank you for writing it. It was so beautiful. Now we're running out of time. Now, Phil, the first time I met you, or one of the first times, you introduced me to J.D. Pratt and his poetry. And you knew I liked poetry. And you introduced me to the poem Seagulls. But I think you write like E.J. Pratt. And I'm wondering if you could read or recite Flamborough Head, which is in the book. And it's a poem written by you, and it's written about a very intimate experience that you had again with your father.
Here am I caught by the foaming tide on the cliff's sharp slope and ragged side, by a timeless scene of seas breaking down, as they end in a roar on the shallow ground, with the mist to show for its labor of pain, as the boundless immortal torn out its gain. Through eons pounding on this place, has the agony been chiseled into its face. Yet these dark stones are just as strong, 'cause this mad struggle's continued on. Here majestically the bluffs stand tall, boasting their will with a lonely call. Yes, here am I caught by the foundering tide, on the cliff-sharp slope and ragged side, by a timeless scene of life's agony, and the invincible spirit is given me.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that sums up, Guy, you, the passion that you had that went into this book and the writing of it. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming today and for sharing the book with us. And for all of our readers, you can go to your local library and request the book. I don't think they're in from processing yet, but you can request them. You can do an interlibrary loan. And you can also go on to your website if you wanted to purchase a book. What's your website?
I have a website. It's gothelength.com.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you again, Phil.
Thank you for having me.